Gino, this guy blows dead dogs. Just lay it in there.
Eat shit and die, Ricky.
Eat shit and live, Bill.
Sleepaway Camp is an American low-budget slasher film from 1983. It was written and directed by Robert Hiltzik and is often compared to the Friday the 13th franchise, seeing as both movies have a similar plot that revolves around the murders of teenagers at a summer camp. Now, at first glance, if you haven't seen Sleepaway Camp, and maybe even if you have, it may seem like a cheap knockoff, a quick cash grab for the ever-growing slasher genre that was really starting to take off during the 80s. The film has garnered a cult following among horror fans, but has also been regarded as fairly trashy and lowbrow. It was made for $350,000 and was finished filming in 5 weeks. Unlike many slashers of the time, and honestly, unlike lots of films today, the cast was made of actual children and teenagers instead of adults playing younger roles. Even the camp that they filmed at was one that the director and writer had visited as a child. These aspects make Sleepaway Camp feel, well, kind of real. I mean, don't get me wrong, this movie is very campy and awkward and uncomfortable, but that adds to its authenticity. In a similar dark vein that's eerie and somewhat reminiscent of something like Welcome to the Dollhouse, Sleepaway Camp reminds us of exactly how brutal adolescence can be, especially if you're trans. So let's talk a little bit more about what exactly Sleepaway Camp is. The film opens a few years earlier near the summer camp. A family, Angela and her brother Peter, along with their father, are out for a nice day on the lake. Unfortunately, after a boating accident, Angela's brother Peter and her father both die as a result of this, but this scene is extremely campy and really sets the tone for the rest of the film. After the boating accident, we're back in present day where Angela and her cousin Ricky are getting ready to head off to summer camp. The film follows the rest of her stay at the summer camp. Her very shy and introverted personality makes her an extremely easy target for bullying and abuse. This, along with her childhood trauma from the boating accident, culminates in a character that is docile, quiet, and very reserved. She spends the movie tormented by her peers as they continue to bully her, and is even targeted by abusive adults as well. As the film progresses, each person who terrorizes her is killed off, and the murderer is unknown because we usually get these killer POV-style shots, hence the Friday the 13th association. In the end, Angela is revealed as the killer, and the film leaves us with a trail of murders and a twist ending that Angela is actually transgender. There's a scene in particular that stands out to me, especially in relation to the movie's queer themes. One of the bullies, Judy, targets Angela, and there's an interesting emphasis on the way that Angela is othered here.
I didn't do anything. You never do shit. Give me that. Hey, Angela. How come you never take showers when the rest of us do? Huh? You queer or something? Oh, I know what it is. You haven't reached puberty yet. Is that it? I bet you don't even have your period. That's enough, Judy. Angela's allowed to shower in the morning or any other time she wants to. Yeah. She takes showers when no one can you'll see she has no hair down below. Judy! She's a real carpenter's dream. The light is a board and needs a screw. That's enough! Fuck off!
Throughout the film, the obsession people seem to have with Angela's body is a prime example of how society treats trans people and their bodies in real life. There are intersections of desire and objectification that happen to her. People are either predatory in their desire for her or othering her because of her body, telling her she's a freak because she's underdeveloped or less feminine than the other girls. There's a constant policing of Angela's body and how well or poorly she performs gender. This happens to sort of emulate the treatment of trans bodies, the simultaneous disgust and fear of them, and yet the want of them and the fetishization of them as well. Her body is also a source of pain, and not necessarily in a traditional internal dysphoria narrative, though you could probably argue that as well, but rather her body is constantly up for scrutiny, for judgment and ridicule, and is also subjected to harm. It's preyed upon. Her body, like the bodies of actual trans people, is often treated as something that does not belong to her, but that belongs to those around her. It's also worth noting that the only friend Angela actually makes at camp is a boy named Paul, who she meets through Ricky, and although he's sweet at first, he too begins to blatantly disregard her boundaries. They have their second kissing scene where, despite her telling him to stop, he continues. And during this moment, she gets a flashback to her childhood where it's revealed that her father was gay after she and her brother Peter see him in bed with his partner. We also then see Peter pointing to Angela as they sit across from one another, and this is meant to foreshadow the trans reveal at the end and also alludes to another big part of the twist. This implies that having a gay father has somehow led Angela to being trans or being confused about her gender, which is obviously a problem on its own, but I'll try to get more into that later. To sum it all up, as her abuse at camp worsens and her bullies are killed off one by one, the story comes to its final head when dead bodies are found around the camp. Two of the counselors come across Angela naked with Paul in her lap. He looks to be sleeping as she sings to him a eerie lullaby-like tune, and this is when we get the flashback that reveals the big shock that Angela is actually her brother Peter. While the real Angela died in the boating accident, it was Peter who survived. Aunt Martha explains that she's always wanted a little girl and decides to rename Peter Angela after his dead sister and raises him in appearance and socialization as a girl.
It'll be a nice little surprise when Richard comes home to find a little girl in the house. Yes, I've always dreamed of a little girl just like you. I mean, we already have a boy, so another one simply would not do. Oh, no, absolutely not. A little girl would be so much nicer, don't you think so, Angela? Angela. Such a lovely name. Why, I believe it means angel. Why, yes, I'm sure it does. I know you're going to like that name. Won't you, Peter?
Then cut back to the present day again, where Paul's head falls on the ground and Angela stands nude with a knife. This reveals her as the killer and also reveals that she has a penis. This is it. This is the big trans reveal, and, well, it's pretty bad.
Oh my God, she's a boy.
Okay, so that was kind of a lot. By the way, this ending is regarded as like one of the best twist endings in the slasher genre, or at least it was at the time. Now, obviously, this is kind of a problem, seeing that the twist is that Angela is, transgender and didn't tell anyone. There's an emphasis on this genital reveal because the Great Shock is supposed to be Angela's body, and the fact that it doesn't align with what everyone expects it to be. The line of, "My God, she's a boy," is very emblematic of the harmful stereotype that trans women face. That idea of them being men in dresses, men who disguise themselves as women. Not only is this extremely transphobic and transmisogynistic, but also the pathologization of being trans is an issue as well. The image of Angela as a mentally ill serial killer calls back to other transphobic depictions in horror. And though it's worth noting that not all of these depictions claim these characters as trans, they don't need to in order for audiences to leave with the impression of a trans identity. They're meant to emulate them in one way or another, whether it's as literal as Sleepaway Camp or even a vague depiction of gender nonconformity for the aforementioned examples. The point is that it's an issue. Horror often represents societal fears, and monsters are oftentimes more metaphorical and symbolic of actual things and people that pose a threat to normalcy. And it's not hard to see why someone could easily walk away from this film with the idea that trans people, specifically trans women, are dangerous. In the article post, How Can It Be She's a Boy, Trans Misogyny in Sleepaway Camp, Willow McClay says that by venturing into the complicated gendered territory first explored by Hitchcock's fascinations with violent queerness in Murder and in Psycho, the film portrays the transgender female body as monstrous and murderous. And it's true, it's a horror film, and the final scene that's supposed to really shock you to your core is Angela's body, a trans woman's body, or at least the representation of it. All this being said, I think Angela is interesting, because her transness can be read in a multitude of different ways. She exists in a sort of complex ambiguity in terms of her identity as a character. The film leaves us with the most obvious impression that Angela is meant to be a cis person's worst fear of what a trans woman is. The idea of a man in a dress, a mentally ill, violent killer, all showcase this, and it lines up very much with the reveal of Angela's birth sex and the nudity scene at the end. The exclamation of her being a boy, the idea that Angela is really Peter disguised as a girl. Yet, the story also suggests that Angela, or rather Peter, is a trans guy, or at least has a narrative that mirrors a trans-masculine experience. A little boy forced by his aunt to live and assimilate to life as a girl, who fails to fit in with his female peers and to live up to the feminine roles and expectations assigned to him, who snaps from all the violence along with the pressure to fit into a gender identity that he's not. Everyone calls him Angela, regards him as a girl as something he knows he isn't. In the article in praise of the bad transgender object Sleepaway Camp, K.L. M. Keegan posits another view of the film and its trans narrative, shifting the interpretation from a trans-misogynistic caricature to a trans-masculine anti-hero. As said by Keegan in the article, given the surfeit of negative images of trans women and the near total lack of images of trans men, why should we read Sleepaway Camp as trans-misogynistic when the film is more accurately read as a trans-masculine revenge tale? Sleepaway Camp ironically captures the paradoxes of trans male identification in a manner that few narratively trans films accomplish. And it's true. The reality is that trans representation in general is oftentimes rare, but when it's not, it's mostly comprised of very bleak and negative images that excuse and encourage violence towards trans women both on and off screen. There's a surplus of these harmful portrayals of trans women, but when it comes to trans men and trans masculine people, there are typically neither good nor bad representations of us, but rather a general invisibility. So, is Angela a trans girl? Is Peter a trans boy? Non-binary, maybe? Obviously, there's not really a clear answer to this, because there's not supposed to be. It was written by a cis person in the 80s, who obviously doesn't know what being trans actually means, or at least didn't at the time. There's inconsistency with whether Peter chose to be Angela because of his gay father and queer upbringing, or was forced into this identity because of Aunt Martha. Instead of following an actual narrative of transness, because once again, it was written by a cis person, it seems to incorporate multiple narratives that represent an amalgamation of the fears surrounding trans people. And even then, if you take away both of the aforementioned interpretations, you're left with what would be a strangely relevant fear of transphobes today. the idea that adults are forcing children into transitioning and placing trans identities onto cisgender kids. If you view it through this lens, Aunt Martha not only forces Peter to become Angela, but forces him to become trans. Regardless of your personal interpretation, the movie ends up accidentally showing how harmful forcing an identity on anyone can be. This film came out during the 80s, and under the Reagan administration in America, perhaps one of the scariest things was queer people. Yet, despite decades passing, the film still ends up echoing a lot of fears we see today. The reveal that Angela's father was gay is also meant to serve as another explanation for Angela's trans identity. Many homophobes and transphobes alike still think that having two parents of the same gender will emotionally stunt a kid and lead them to be confused about gender roles and identities themselves. And I mean, this was made when gay marriage wasn't legal and the AIDS epidemic was killing the LGBT community. When LGBT people were being left to fend for themselves by our government and regarded as sexual deviants whose deaths were either ignored or justified as a lesson on the moral depravity of gay sex. Given this context, it totally makes sense why queerness was at the forefront of this film. And it wasn't just Sleepaway Camp. The 80s saw many queer-themed and coded horror movies, mostly because of the homophobia that ran rampant during the AIDS and HIV epidemic. Queer people were a threat. They were seen as monsters and villains in real life, which is why they were depicted that way on screen too. Queerness was the true horror of the time, and to an extent still is. Returning back to Angela, I think that this movie finds itself at a crossroads. On one hand, it can and does perpetuate the message that queer people are mentally ill, confused, dangerous, and violent, and that trans people especially are not who we say we are or that we owe anyone the disclosure of our transness. And, on another hand, I think it accidentally serves as an almost perfect trans allegory. Angela/Peter is forced to assimilate to cishet society regardless of how you look at it, forced to live as a gender they don't resonate with at least at one point or another. And while the trans serial killer depiction is by no means made less harmful, I think it's worth noting that Angela is meant to be a sympathetic character. Yes, she's the killer, but she's still the protagonist, and you can't help but cheer for her after spending the entire movie watching her be brutalized by everyone around her. Although Angela definitely enacts her own version of what she thinks is right, the point is that despite her being another trans serial killer, she stands out because she's allowed to be both vengeful and sympathetic. Unlike other depictions of trans people in horror, you root for her because you want to protect her from all the abuse she endures. She stands alone as an accidental anti-hero or even a protagonist, fighting for her life and enacting revenge instead of a completely one-dimensional monster. And even with a less literal interpretation and a more figurative one, she still represents a sort of catharsis. She stands up for herself and learns to become autonomous, and she refuses to continue to be abused and hurt. And no, I don't count this movie as trans representation or queer representation, and I'm not praising it as such. But I do think it offers a more nuanced look at gender than one might expect, especially for a film that came out in the 80s. It does shed light on what we find so horrific, so scary about trans people and queer people in general, the fears around trans bodies, and it highlights the way that transness disrupts a sort of cis and straight hegemony and threatens these rigid structures of gender and sexuality. So I guess that's it. You don't have to like this movie, I mean, there are reasons not to, but I also think if you're critical enough, it's okay to find a more nuanced appreciation for it as well, specifically if you're queer. The thing is there isn't really a lot of trans representation out there, as I said before, and it's certainly gotten better, but for a while, and even still to an extent, horror is one of the few places that we're able to find anything that remotely resembles a portrayal of us. And while other horror films typically denote trans women to be one-note villains and leave trans men and non-binary people out of their depictions altogether, Sleepaway Camp at least offers the interpretation of something more promising. At least below its very obvious surface flaws of transphobia and bad representation, it gives us the interpretation of a trans character that has nuance and complexity. A character whose rage and violence doesn't stem from being trans itself, but rather from being exploited and abused by a transphobic society. With all this being said, the last thing that I want to add is that the summer camp is not the only camp in this movie, if you know what I mean, because it's campy as hell. It would have won that Met Gala a few years ago. Okay, sorry. Bye.